Mr. Ballard, today's date is 4/13/23, and this is Mr. Ballard. Say your full name and date of birth.
Charles Michael Ballard, and my date of birth was June the 25th, 1936.
And you were in the Army Reserve. Tell us what year you went in and when you went out.
I was in the Army Reserve, and I went in 1957, and I got out in 1963.
Okay. We're right here at the Evansville Wartime Museum, and behind us is a tri-motor Ford, and this is a very historic day. The tri-motor Ford was the one that stimulated air traffic in 1928-29. They were built, 199 of them were built from 1926 to 1933, but they were a quantum leap in airplane commercial traffic, and it started all commercial traffic. The reason we're doing that as a backdrop is we're going to talk about Mr. Ballard, and tell us where you're from, when you're born.
I was born in Vincennes, Indiana in 1936.
All right. And Army Reserve, tell the different places you were stationed.
Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I was there the most. I spent 6 months there in Fort Leonard Wood. I was in Fort Riley, Kansas. I was in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin a lot. Several times.
And then what did the Army Reserve and the Army teach you?
It taught me a lot of discipline to start with. It also taught me how serious things could be.
You're right there between 57 and 63, right during the Vietnam era where it really kicked up. But how do you tell this next generation? You got a nephew here, grandson. Tell us about freedom.
It's not cheap. At some point or another, you're going to pay for it over and over again. There's never going to be a time in my thinking where we're not going to have to stand up and be counted. Has had to pay a price to live in a country as great as we've got. And I'm afraid that we're going to have to stand up in the future. We cannot ever let any kind of a foreign power dictate to the world. And every time we do, then we pay serious consequences.
You've learned that wisdom. We got to get it in the young kids' mind as well, but that's going to take people like you, your son, and other people. Now, tell us about your uncle from World War II. Give me his first name, last name, and where he was stationed, what he did, and how he's related to your mother.
Yes, my uncle's name was Charles Steinsberger, and we called him Chick. That was his nickname. And he was next to the youngest in my mother's family. And Chick was really a wonderful guy. Like I say, I was fairly small when he was in the service. But he went into World War II. He was about 23, somewhere in that neighborhood. And he wanted to be a pilot. And they trained him to be a bomber pilot. And he flew B-24 Liberator bombers. And he was shipped overseas in 1944 to fight the Japanese in the Philippines. And he was in what they call a photography squadron. And they went out and they photographed targets to be bombed and targets to be invaded. He flew a B-24. He was, at the time of his death, he was a co-pilot on a B-24 Liberator bomber. And they were heading out to photograph a mission. There was 11 young men on that plane. There was 2 specialists that took pictures, along with a full bomber crew except for a bombardier. And they had to have every turret manned. because they would run into Japanese planes from time to time. So he was flying January the 11th, 1945, a three-man squadron to take pictures of a Japanese base to bomb it. And one plane turned around with engine trouble immediately. The other two planes, including my uncle, went straight ahead to the target. And when they were close to the target, they received a message that the target was socked in. They couldn't take any pictures, and they were to turn around and come home immediately. The first plane turned around and made it home. My uncle's plane radioed that he was making a left turn and was turning around, and we never heard from him again. There was, at the time, a typhoon in the area. You have to remember, in World War II, there was no weather radar on these planes, so they couldn't see it. It's thought that my uncle's plane probably ran into the typhoon itself. The typhoon gobbled it up, carried it a distance, and threw it out. He was never found. Nobody was found. He was declared missing for a full year and then declared dead a year later.
All right,
he was a second lieutenant when he died.
Okay, we're going to move inside because they're going to start this Ford plane, this Ford Trimor that we talked about a minute ago. But the reason we're doing the Trimor in the background is if you think of World War II, there were 18,000 B-24s built. The biggest multi-engine and more multi-engine plane than has ever been made.
You're right.
Since that time. Unbelievable. Right. He made one every 63 minutes at will run. 18,000 of those babies. Amazing plane, good altitude, good power. It was a high wing. We're going to go inside. We're continuing. We just talked about the B-24. How old were you when World War II was going on, Mr. Ballard?
Well, I was
born what year?
In 36, and I was 9 years old when it ended.
Yes. So you remember some of it?
I remember a lot of it. Most of it dealing with the home front. Mm-hmm. I remember the things that we all went through as a family. Contrary to what a lot of people think, there wasn't a whole lot of things you could buy during World War II if you were a civilian, even food. And my parents, my mother, she was feeding two of us, my brother and myself. And my dad was in the Navy at that time, and he was being trained as a radar operator. But we had to get ration stamps and ration books, and we filled up ration books with ration stamps, and that entitled us to go to a corner grocery store. We didn't have supermarkets. We had corner grocery stores. And we had to turn in those stamp books to even qualify for, say, a pound of sugar. And you had to have the money for it too, but you couldn't buy it if you had the money. You had to have the stamps too. It was even more serious if you tried to buy a battery for your car or tires. So I remember all that. I also remember my mother followed my father in his training, and at first his training first started out in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And Mom put us in a car and we traveled. She drove to Fort Lauderdale, Florida from Vincennes, Indiana. And we got a little place to stay there while my dad was going through training. And lo and behold, while we were still there, we ran into a hurricane. And since we were Navy people, my mother was allowed to go on base with my brother and I, and they put us up in a commandeered hotel that the Navy had. And it was structurally sound. And they put us on the third floor. And we weathered that storm on the third floor of this Navy place, which was a whole hotel. And we kept hearing things hitting. We kept hearing things hitting the glass outside on the veranda, up 3 stories. It turned out to be fish that was blowing out of the ocean.
Wow.
Small fish that were blowing up and hit the glass bounced up on the terrace. So we weathered that.
Wait a
My dad was transferred to Point Montera, California for his last little bit of training before he'd ship out. And that was a naval training area for all types of calibers of guns. And this was built right on the bottom of the cliffs in Point Montera, across the harbor from San Francisco Bay. I could see Alcatraz as a small boy on a clear day. The first night I was there, and my dad got us a place to stay, a home. You have to remember, in World War II, a lot of people vacated around the California area. Some went in the service and some got out of there because they were afraid of the Japanese invading that area. So we were able to get a really nice home to stay in. And the first night, I thought the world might be becoming invaded because all of these guns went off. And it was the most beautiful sight I ever saw, all these tracers and things going up in the air. And they were shooting at different things they pulled what they called socks, wind socks that you see at airports. Well, they were pulling socks behind planes to shoot at. But the big thing was, during the daylight hours, they had drones. And these were pretty good sized drones. And they would set those drones off, and they would have the naval gunners try to shoot those drones down. And the naval gunners would hit those drones, and when those drones would get hit, I would be out in my yard and I would see it and I would run to where it was, and I always got beat by the Navy Jeep. And the Navy always took them back. But I always wanted a wing or a prop or something from one of the drones. So I remember that, and Dad had his orders to go out, and Dad was trained to some way they were trying to tie radar into the guns to where what you saw on the radar screen they could shoot at and be more accurate. So that's what Dad was trained in. And he had his bags packed and was ready to go, and the war was over in August of 1945. He just missed being shipped out.
So you came back to Evansville,
So my dad-
hopside by train with
Yes,
them. Yeah.
my dad was spared, my uncle was not. So we, as a family, we remembered a lot.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ballard. I appreciate this, and Bo's done a lot for the airport here. Thank you for your service. Thank your uncle for his service. Appreciate it, and send some other people from Hopside down here.
I'll do
Love
that.
to have them. Thanks.
You got a beautiful